Welcome to the deep dive. Ready to really get into it with acceleration in those construction contracts we all know and love.
Always exciting stuff.
We're lucky enough to have the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors Acceleration Practice Information to guide us.
Second edition, freshly printed February 2024.
So fresh. Okay, before we get lost in the pages, remind us, what exactly are we talking about when we say acceleration?
Right, so it's not just saying work faster. It's more, strategically getting a project to finish earlier than planned. A bit more finesse involved.
Got it. So like strategically moving up that finish line. Okay, I'm curious then, why would anyone want to accelerate? Doesn't that just make things, I don't know, more hectic?
Hectic, maybe, but often worthwhile. For contractors, it can be a way to, say, reduce those day-to-day site costs. Finishing early means they can move their team to a new project, more efficient use of resources.
Right. I imagine having your best people ready for that next big project is pretty valuable.
Absolutely. Then from the employer side, well, they're often motivated by avoiding those nasty penalties for late completion. Or maybe there's a time-sensitive opportunity, like a store opening, that they really want to capitalize on.
So financial incentives all around. Makes sense. But how does this acceleration thing actually work within the contracts themselves?
Right. So common standard forms like our trusty JCT, NEC4, and ICC, they all address it. But, and this is important for QS folks, each one has its own, let's call them quirks.
Quirks, you say?
Yeah.
Love a good quirk. Let's start with JCT. What makes it stand out in the acceleration game?
JCT loves its acceleration quotations, but it's not just about a contractor saying, hey, I can finish faster, but it'll cost you.
There's more to it.
Oh, yeah. See, JCT also has these things called deemed instructions. Basically, if the employer doesn't respond to a proper acceleration quote within the set time,
It's like they've agreed by staying silent.
you got it. It's considered a deemed instruction to go ahead with the acceleration.
That's wild. Silence speaks volumes in JCT. Now, everyone's always talking about deadlines. What kind of timelines are we dealing with here?
Okay, so usually the contractor has 21 days to send in their quotation unless everyone agrees on something different. But here's where it gets tight. The employer, they've only got 7 days to accept.
Wow, that's a pretty small window for such a potentially big decision.
It can be a lot of pressure, which is why it's so important for QS professionals to be on top of things, advising their clients every step of the way.
Communication is key. Got it. Now, what about NEC4? How does it approach this whole acceleration business?
NEC4, it's all about the project manager. They're the ones setting the new, earlier completion date, and they're responsible for asking the contractor for that acceleration quote.
So a bit more collaborative than JCT.
In a way, yeah. It shifts some of the decision-making power up front. Could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. Just depends on the project team's dynamic, really.
Makes sense. And ICC, how do they handle this acceleration dance?
ICC keeps it simple. Agree on the price tag before any acceleration work starts. No surprises there.
Sounds refreshingly straightforward.
Right. But here's something interesting. Even if acceleration isn't specifically mentioned in the main contract, you can still create separate agreements just for that.
Wait, seriously? You can just tack that on even if it wasn't part of the initial deal?
Yep. It's about being adaptable. But, and this is particularly important for those QS folks out there, these agreements, they've got to be airtight. We're talking clearly outlining who's responsible if things go wrong, what completion actually means. That's a big one, even having an exit strategy if the whole acceleration thing just isn't panning out.
Like a mini contract within the main contract. Definitely want your legal team to give that the once-over.
Absolutely. Now, have you ever heard of implied instructions to accelerate?
Implied, like it's not written down, but the pressure's still on.
Exactly. Imagine an employer constantly harping on about finishing on time. Even hinting that delays just won't fly, even if those delays aren't the contractor's fault.
Sounds like a recipe for tension.
Right. And the contractor might point to the extension of time clause in the contract, but a desperate employer might not want to hear it.
So then what? Is the contractor obligated to speed things up just because the employer's breathing down their neck?
That's where things get tricky. In England, there's this legal principle about mitigating losses from a contract breach.
Okay.
Now, some argue that this means a contractor always has to try to accelerate to make up for lost time, even if the employer caused the delays.
Hold on. Even if it's not their fault.
Some say so, but legal cases seem to indicate a contractor only has to do what a reasonable contractor would in the same situation.
So no need to go crazy spending money or taking unnecessary risks to bail out a disorganized employer.
Exactly. And specific contract clauses, like you find in the JCT standard building contract, they focus on preventing more delays, not necessarily recovering from delays that are already there.
So no automatic obligation to speed up in those cases.
Yeah.
But a contractor might choose to accelerate to avoid penalties for their own delays.
Now you're getting it. Sometimes it's just cheaper to make up for lost time, even if the contract doesn't force them to.
Makes sense. So let's say everyone agrees to accelerate, everything's signed, but then, despite best efforts, the project doesn't finish early. Who ends up paying for that?
$1 million question, right? The funny thing is, those standard forms we keep talking about, totally silent on this. They tell you how to set up the agreement, but don't say who takes the hit if it goes south.
Seriously. That's surprising, to say the least.
It happens more than you'd think. Leads to a lot of disputes.
So how do you avoid a legal nightmare?
It's all about being clear from the start. If the employer wants the contractor to shoulder the entire risk of hitting that new completion date, that needs to be crystal clear in the agreement. Of course, the contractor will likely build a hefty risk premium into their price.
Because they're basically taking a gamble that they can deliver,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Now, if the employer's open to sharing that risk, they might get a lower price, but they'll need a super detailed breakdown of how the acceleration will actually work.
So they can track the progress and see where the money's going.
Exactly. That's trust, built on clear communication and shared expectations.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, before we jump into the how of making things go faster, we've got to talk about defining completion. If there's no agreement on what finished actually looks like.
You can't assess if the acceleration was successful, you're spot on.
So how do we avoid that whole disagreement?
Again, communication is key. Before anyone signs anything, both sides need to be on the same page about what completion means for this specific project. Details are your friend here. The more specific, the better.
Solid advice. Okay, now I'm ready to hear about how contractors actually wave their magic wands and accelerate things.
All right, let's get into the nitty-gritty of making those deadlines disappear. Well, the first trick isn't that glamorous. We're talking about extending those working hours on site.
Okay, so longer days, weekend work, maybe even holidays.
You got it. Adding even just one extra hour to each day, it can make a difference. Of course, that's where things get interesting for our QS friends.
Because, as we all know, time equals money. More hours means higher costs for the contractor.
Exactly. You've got overtime pay, maybe even bonuses to keep those workers motivated. And then there's the fact that tired people don't work as efficiently. You can't ignore that.
Right, you can't expect peak performance 12 hours straight.
No way. And then think about the logistics. Deliveries, subcontractors, inspections, all with everyone working late, needs serious planning, especially for QS professionals who have to make sure every decision makes financial sense.
And let's not forget those noise ordinances, especially in residential areas. Construction's already disruptive enough without those extra hours.
Absolutely. You've got to think about the impact on the community and, of course, follow all those pesky regulations.
Right, so extending hours isn't always the answer. What's next in our contractor's bag of tricks?
Well, they could always bring in the reinforcements. More workers, more equipment, even more supervision.
More hands on deck, but at what cost?
It doesn't come cheap, but the idea is that more resources equal faster work. But, and this is where our QS folks come in, you've got to carefully analyze the cost-benefit of every single resource you add. It's about finding that balance, maximizing productivity without hitting a point where it backfires.
Right, because too much of a good thing can actually make things worse. Yeah. Too many cooks in the kitchen, as they say.
Exactly. If you just keep adding one resource without thinking about the others, you end up creating bottlenecks, which slows everything down.
Like having 100 skilled bricklayers, but only one cement mixer? Recipe for disaster.
Precisely. Or imagine mountains of materials delivered with nowhere to store them. Total chaos. QS professionals, they're the ones who make sure things stay balanced, cost-effective, and efficient.
So it's not just about throwing more resources at the problem. It's about being strategic.
Absolutely. And don't forget all those logistical things. More workers mean you might need more space, more bathroom facilities, more safety equipment. Even things like parking become an issue.
Right, you can't just cram people in like sardines. That's an accident waiting to happen.
And we all know what that means. Potential legal issues, project delays, not exactly helpful when you're trying to accelerate. Safety regulations are there for a reason.
Okay, so we've covered longer hours, more resources. What other tools do contractors have at their disposal?
This one's all about finesse. We're talking about tweaking that construction schedule.
You mean like rearranging tasks, like some
Yeah.
kind of high-stakes project management puzzle?
Exactly. Sometimes by changing the order of things, or by overlapping tasks that were supposed to happen one after the other, you can shave off a surprising amount of time.
Okay, I can see how that might work, but it seems a bit risky. What if you overlook something important, some dependency between tasks?
It's definitely not without risk. That's why this strategy needs meticulous planning, a deep understanding of the project's critical path, and of course, collaboration with everyone involved.
Sounds like a delicate dance, especially for QS professionals trying to keep track of the financial side of things. Any changes to the schedule can impact cash flow and those dreaded variations.
100%. QS professionals need to be involved in those discussions from the get-go, making sure everyone understands the financial implications of those schedule adjustments.
So what would be a good example of tasks you might rearrange or overlap?
Okay, picture this. You're working on a building, and the plan is to finish all the drywalling before any painting starts. Standard stuff, right? But if some rooms are done early, why not start painting those while the drywallers finish up elsewhere?
Okay, that makes sense. But I can see how that would need a ton of coordination and probably a few extra site visits for our QS friends to make sure everything's on track.
Absolutely. Without clear communication and some flexibility from everyone, these kinds of changes can easily turn into a logistical nightmare.
And I'm guessing there are times when overlapping tasks, even with the best intentions, can backfire spectacularly.
Oh, for sure. Imagine installing expensive flooring before the plastering is completely dry. You end up with warped flooring, costly repairs, delays, the opposite of what you want.
Ouch. That's a good reminder that acceleration should never come at the cost of quality.
Exactly. Trying to rush a job almost always leads to more problems down the line, which usually means someone's paying for it.
Okay, so be strategic when it comes to messing with that schedule. What about bringing in extra help, like temporary structures?
Now, those can be game changers, especially when you're battling those unpredictable elements looking at you, weather.
So things like temporary roofs, protective screens, that sort of thing.
You got it. Think of it like creating a little bubble around your project so the work can continue no matter what Mother Nature throws at you.
Like a force field against the elements. But those bubbles probably don't come cheap.
Definitely not. You've got to factor in the materials, installation, even running costs like lighting and ventilation if you're working inside one.
And I bet there are some serious safety concerns too. Those temporary structures need to be built to last.
Absolutely. They need to be properly designed and constructed to handle whatever the weather throws at them. And, most importantly, they need to be safe for everyone on site. The last thing anyone wants is a strong gust of wind turning that temporary roof into a projectile.
No, that would be a disaster. Speaking of disasters, are there any other acceleration strategies we should be aware of?
We've covered the main ones, but there are always more tricks up our sleeves.
Do tell. I'm always up for a good construction magic trick.
Well, you could think about tweaking the actual methods of work, maybe switching to prefabricated components or using some fancy technology to speed things up.
So it's not just about working longer or adding more people, but also finding smarter, more efficient ways to get things done.
Exactly. And this is another area where QS professionals can really shine. They can use their expertise to figure out the costs and benefits of different approaches.
Love it. But we'll have to save those deeper dives for another day. For now, let's switch gears and talk about the employer's role in all of this.
Sounds good. They're definitely not just sitting on the sidelines.
So we've talked about all the contractor's tools for accelerating a project, longer hours, more people, rearranging the schedule, even building those temporary structures to keep things moving. But what about the employer? They're not just signing checks and watching the clock, are they?
Not at all. They can be a real driving force in acceleration, and their role goes way beyond just approving budget increases.
Really? So it's a team effort.
Absolutely. One of the biggest things an employer can do is be flexible with the project specifications.
You mean like swapping out materials, maybe choosing something that's easier to get hold of?
Exactly. Imagine the specs call for some fancy imported tile that takes 6 months to arrive. The employer could suggest a local alternative that's available right away. Might mean a slightly different look, but it could shave weeks, even months, off the schedule.
A little flexibility can go a long way, but I'm guessing you can only deviate so far from the original plan before you run into problems.
Oh, absolutely. You have to consider the overall goals. If that imported tile is crucial to the design, or it's important to the client's brand, it might not be a compromise worth making.
Right. Choose your battles. So what else can employers do to help speed things along?
They can be open to design changes. And just to be clear, this is different from those specification changes we talked about earlier.
Okay, I'm listening. What's the difference?
Think of it this way. Specifications are like the ingredients list. The design is the actual recipe. So instead of swapping out an ingredient, we're talking about maybe simplifying a complex detail or tweaking the layout to make it faster to build.
Makes sense. But wouldn't that involve a lot of back and forth with the architects and engineers?
It can, which is why good communication is so important. The employer needs to be upfront about wanting to accelerate, and the design team needs to be ready to be flexible and find solutions. And for our QS friends, this means being ready for potential variations and making sure any changes are properly valued and documented.
It's a balancing act, speeding things up while still keeping the integrity of the design. And of course, keeping an eye on the budget the whole time.
Exactly. And sometimes the best thing an employer can do is adjust the project scope.
You mean cutting things out completely?
Not necessarily cutting, maybe just postponing things. It's about figuring out what's absolutely essential for that initial handover and what can wait.
So things that could be finished later without affecting the building's functionality.
Precisely. Maybe that fancy landscaping can wait, or those non-essential fixtures can be installed later. This is another area where QS professionals can really contribute. They can help assess the cost and time implications of these scope adjustments and make sure everything aligns with the overall project goals.
I'm seeing how all these pieces fit together. You've got the contractor making adjustments on site, the employer making strategic decisions to keep things moving, and the QS team making sure it all adds up financially.
It's a carefully coordinated dance. Everyone has to be in sync. But now let's talk about everyone's favorite topic, money.
Right, because it's all well and good to talk strategy, but someone has to pay for it all. What goes into those acceleration quotations?
Well, at its core, it's a breakdown of all the costs associated with those acceleration measures we've been discussing. You've got your basic costs, labor, plant hire, materials.
And nuts and bolts of getting things done faster.
Exactly. Then you've got those loss and expense items. Those are a bit trickier, but basically they cover the indirect costs that come with accelerating a project.
Give me an example. What kind of things fall under loss and expense?
Think about unproductive overtime. Maybe you've got crew members on standby because the delivery is late, or you're paying for extra supervision because you've got multiple shifts running.
It's the cost of the disruption, that inefficiency that often comes with trying to speed things up.
Exactly. You might also have things like increased costs for site accommodation because you've got a bigger workforce, or maybe you need more storage space because you're stockpiling materials.
It's amazing how those little things add up so quickly.
They really do. And let's not forget the contractor's overheads and profit margin. They're running a business after all.
Right, they're not doing it for free.
Exactly. Now, here's where it gets interesting for QS folks. Assessing the risk involved in these quotations.
Risk. Tell me more.
Well, remember how we talked about how acceleration measures don't always guarantee an earlier completion date? Things happen.
That's the nature of construction.
Exactly. So when a contractor puts together an acceleration quote, they have to factor in the possibility, however small, that they won't actually achieve those time savings. And if the contract says they're fully responsible for hitting that new deadline,
I'm guessing they're going to build in a risk premium to cover themselves.
you got it. It's like an insurance policy in case things go wrong. The challenge for QS professionals is that this risk premium can be hard to pin down. It's not always presented as a separate line item in the quote.
So how can an employer or their QS know if they're getting a fair deal?
Transparency is key. It's perfectly reasonable for a QS to ask for a detailed breakdown of how that risk premium was calculated. This is where their expertise is so valuable, digging into the details and making sure their client understands the potential costs involved.
It's about understanding the why behind the numbers, not just the numbers themselves.
Exactly. Now, generally speaking, there are two main ways contractors structure these acceleration quotations: lump sum or itemized.
Okay, what's the difference? Lay it on me.
A lump sum quote is just that, one fixed price for achieving the accelerated completion date. Simple to administer, but it can be a bit of a black box for the employer.
Because they don't see the individual costs.
Right. Now, an itemized quotation, that breaks everything down. You see the labor rates, the material costs, even the allowance for overheads.
So it's much more transparent. That's got to be helpful for QS professionals. They need that level of detail to do their jobs effectively.
Absolutely. It lets them really scrutinize those costs, maybe even identify areas for negotiation. They can make sure everything aligns with their client's budget.
Makes sense. So when would you use one approach over the other?
It depends. It depends on the project, the level of risk, all sorts of factors. If it's a simple acceleration with clear risks, a lump sum might be fine. But if things are more complex or if there's a higher chance of things going off track, a detailed itemized quotation gives everyone more visibility and control. And that's crucial for QS professionals who are responsible for managing those risks.
It's like choosing between a prefix menu and ordering a la carte. Sometimes you want simplicity, sometimes you need flexibility.
Great analogy. And there's one more option we haven't touched on yet: actual cost reimbursement.
So the contractor keeps track of all their costs, and the employer reimburses them.
You got it. It can be a good way to encourage efficiency, but it requires a lot of trust and very detailed record keeping from both sides.
And I imagine it keeps the QS team very busy, making sure all those costs are legitimate and actually related to the acceleration efforts.
Absolutely. It can get very complicated, especially when you've got multiple things happening on a project at the same time.
Well, this has been eye-opening. We've covered acceleration strategies, the intricacies of quotations, and everything in between. As we wrap up, what are the key takeaways for our listeners, especially those working in quantity surveying?
First things first, acceleration is a strategic decision. It's not something you jump into without thinking. You have to carefully weigh the potential benefits against the costs, the risks, and how it might affect both the contractor and the employer. And QS professionals, they're the ones who provide that clear-headed assessment.
They're crunching the numbers, analyzing the risks, guiding their clients to make the best decisions.
Exactly. And as we've said throughout this deep dive, communication is key. Clear, open, constant communication between everyone involved, that's essential for successful acceleration. And QS professionals play a vital role in making that happen, making sure everyone's on the same page and working towards the same goal.
Teamwork makes the dream work even when you're under pressure.
Absolutely. And finally, don't be afraid to ask for help. Talk to colleagues, mentors, industry experts. Getting those outside perspectives can be invaluable when you're navigating the complexities of acceleration. It helps everyone make well-informed decisions.
Solid advice. So as we emerge from this deep dive into the world of acceleration, remember, it's not just about speed. It's about strategy, collaboration, and always reading the fine print.
And don't forget those risk assessments. A little planning up front can save a lot of headaches later on.
Couldn't agree more. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Until next time, happy building.